if you die on a trip to Mars, it probably won't be from some spectacular cinematic rocket explosion.
Right. It's not a Hollywood movie.
Exactly. It will probably be because, I don't know, a single ball bearing in a ventilation fan broke.
Hmm.
And you suffocated in a stagnant, invisible bubble of your own exhaled carbon dioxide while you slept.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It really is. Welcome to today's deep dive. You know, usually when the conversation turns to sending humans to Mars, the focus immediately shifts to the hardware.
Oh, for sure.
Your mind goes to massive, gleaming rockets, the terrifying roar of the main engines, the complex orbital mechanics, and the navigation systems required to thread a needle across millions of miles of just empty, hostile space. We basically treat the entire endeavor as a pure physics problem.
Which completely overshadows the payload itself. I mean, when you launch a communication satellite, the payload is essentially passive, right? It sits inside the fairing, it deploys its solar panels, and it functions.
And it just does its job.
Exactly. It doesn't breathe, it doesn't metabolize, it doesn't get lonely, and it certainly doesn't complain about the smell of the cabin.
Yeah.
But when human beings are the payload, they are not passive cargo. The living crew becomes an essential, highly volatile, active part of the spacecraft system itself.
Wow, yeah.
The real challenge of a Mars mission is the monumental task of keeping ordinary, squishy, demanding human bodies and minds healthy, capable, cooperative, and functional inside an extraordinary machine for years.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly grasp the scale of the engineering challenge here, I want you, the listener, to try a thought experiment. Imagine taking your entire house. So your bedroom, your kitchen, your bathroom, your home office, your gym, your medical cabinet.
That is a lot of stuff.
Right. Now, shrink every single function of that house down to the volume of a medium-sized van. Seal the doors shut. Now, you have to rely on the machinery packed into the walls of that van to keep you alive for a 3-year road trip through a complete vacuum.
And you can never roll down the window.
Never. You can never stop for groceries, and you can never pull over to stretch your legs.
And every single human requirement inside that van, the oxygen in the air, the water, the food, the thermal regulation, the exercise, the hygiene, the waste management, none of these are treated as lifestyle preferences. They have to be translated into strict, unforgiving engineering and operational requirements.
It's if they aren't.
If an aerospace engineer designs a brilliant, highly efficient spacecraft that ignores the daily, gritty routines of the biological organism living inside it, well, that spacecraft will fail and the crew will die.
So our mission today is to explore exactly how those biological realities dictate the machinery of spaceflight. We are unpacking a Cosmora HQ companion overview based on the principal ideas of Mary Roach's fascinating book, Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life in the Void.
It is such a great resource.
It really is. We are going to examine the extreme lengths engineers and doctors must go to in order to keep humans functioning in an environment that actively wants to dismantle them. And before we even touch on what happens to the human body in microgravity, we have to establish the harsh rules of spacecraft design.
Right, the economics of it all.
Yeah, we need to talk about the engineering economy.
So aerospace engineering operates on an economy of trades. They translate those squishy human needs into cold, hard constraints like mass, volume, power draw, water consumption, airflow dynamics, thermal loads, storage space, even maintenance time, and human attention.
That's a lot to balance.
It is. And the fundamental rule of this economy is that all of these constraints are hopelessly, irrevocably linked. There are no isolated improvements in spaceflight.
Meaning every single upgrade or comfort carries a penalty somewhere else in the system.
Inevitably. Like if you decide the crew needs a better, more luxurious shower system to boost morale, well, that system requires more water. Water is incredibly heavy.
Right.
More water means more mass. Pumping and heating that water requires more electrical power. To generate more power, you need larger solar arrays or a heavier power plant.
It just cascades.
Exactly. More mass and a larger spacecraft profile mean you need a significantly larger rocket and vastly more propellant to lift it off the surface of the Earth. All of those additions change the trajectory calculations and introduce new potential points of mechanical failure.
Wow.
So engineers constantly run these trade studies asking what the crew absolutely must have to survive and accomplish the mission versus what is simply a comfort.
Wait, but if a broken toilet or a failed water pump is a literal life or death crisis on a trip to Mars, why not just bring 2 of everything? I mean, we pack spare tires for road trips. Why can't we just build a slightly bigger van, bolt in a backup water purifier, throw in a spare toilet motor, and just take the hit on the extra weight for the sake of survival?
That logic works perfectly on the surface of the Earth, but it shatters the moment you have to pay the gravity tax.
Yeah.
You are fighting the tyranny of the rocket equation.
The rocket equation.
Yeah, every single kilogram of payload you add, whether that's a spare toilet motor, an extra gallon of water, or even a heavy paperback book, requires a massive amount of propellant to lift it out of Earth's gravity well. But it doesn't stop there.
Let me guess, you need fuel for the fuel.
You nailed it.
Huh.
You then need more propellant to lift the propellant you just added to lift the spare motor. The mass fraction of a rocket dictates that the vast majority of a launch vehicle's weight is just fuel. Space and lifting capacity are at an absolute premium. You physically cannot pack your way out of the problem by just bringing endless spares.
Which introduces the massive distinction we have to make between the spaceflight we are accustomed to and the Mars expedition we are planning. Most of our human spaceflight experience over the last few decades, including the International Space Station, takes place in low Earth orbit, or LO.
Right, Mallow.
The ISS is orbiting about 250 miles above us. It seems exotic and distant, but in the grand scale of the solar system, I mean, it is practically sitting on our front porch.
Low Earth orbit offers an established, robust safety net. You have continuous, near real-time communication with mission control in Houston. If a system degrades, hundreds of engineers on the ground can analyze the telemetry and walk the crew through a fix.
You can just call IT.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you have regular resupply ships arriving with fresh clothing, replacement parts, and experimental gear. Most crucially, if a catastrophic medical emergency or a severe depressurization event occurs, the crew can climb into a return capsule and be in a terrestrial hospital bed in a matter of hours. LEO missions are fundamentally tethered to Earth.
But a Mars expedition severs that tether completely. The stakes of traveling to Mars alter the engineering math on a terrifying scale. At its furthest distance, Mars is hundreds of millions of miles away. That distance introduces a communication delay of up to 20 minutes each way.
Just for one message.
Yeah. A simple radio call to ask mission control for advice takes 40 minutes just to get an answer.
Real-time support is entirely eliminated. Furthermore, orbital mechanics dictate the launch windows. You can't just turn the ship around and fly back if someone gets sick.
You're locked in.
Once you execute the trans-Martian injection burn, you are committed to the transit. Evacuation is physically impossible. A replacement part is, at absolute best, months or years away. The machine you leave Earth orbit with is the only machine you have.
That is sobering.
You face vastly longer storage needs for food, massive and prolonged exposure to cosmic radiation, and a medical reality where the crew must handle any trauma or illness entirely on their own.
So the environment is utterly unforgiving, and the machine is rigidly constrained by the laws of physics. That means the people operating that machine have to be perfectly calibrated to the reality of the mission, not just the romance of it.
Exactly.
The biological constraints demand a specific type of human mind. We have to look at who actually gets selected to go.
We really are forced to abandon a lot of cultural mythology here. When we envision astronaut selection, we often rely on the archetype established during the early space race. We picture hotshot test pilots, adrenaline junkies, daredevils with nerves of steel who possess boundless courage for highly dramatic, explosive events.
We look for action heroes who can handle a crisis at Mach 10, the classic right stuff.
Right, but this deep dive reveals that for a long-duration mission to Mars, courage during a violent 8-minute launch sequence is just the absolute bare minimum baseline.
Just the price of admission.
Exactly. The launch is a tiny fraction of the mission. Selection committees for deep space exploration are looking for a totally different, much rarer set of psychological traits.
Like what?
Well, they need an expeditionary mindset. They value an incredible capacity for continuous learning and deep technical competence across multiple disciplines. An astronaut on a Mars mission might need to be a botanist, a plumber, an electrician, a medic, and a systems engineer all in the same week.
Talk about wearing multiple hats.
They need steady, unflappable emotional regulation and exceptional interpersonal teamwork skills. And perhaps most counterintuitively for the general public, they are actively screening for people with a uniquely high tolerance for monotonous routine.
The idea that the ideal astronaut needs a high tolerance for boredom and routine is fascinating.
Yeah.
You actively do not want the adrenaline junkie.
No, you don't.
Because 99% of a multi-year Mars mission is completely devoid of adrenaline. It consists of checking air filters, cataloging biological samples, wiping down surfaces with biocide wipes, and running inventory checks.
Put a pure thrill seeker in a confined metal cylinder for 3 years, assign them a strict daily schedule of preventative maintenance tasks, and they will rapidly deteriorate psychologically. They will seek out stimulation, take unnecessary risks, and chafe against the confinement.
That makes total sense.
You need someone who finds deep, intrinsic satisfaction in the meticulous, flawless execution of daily repetitive tasks. You need individuals who can maintain their focus and good humor when absolutely nothing exciting is happening.
But testing for that specific psychological endurance is incredibly difficult. You can't just give someone a personality questionnaire or conduct a standard job interview to determine if they will mentally break down in a tin can after 2 years.
You really can't.
You have to simulate the environment. The space agencies use elaborate, heavily controlled analogs here on Earth to try and forge this specific crew dynamic.
Analogs isolate specific variables of spaceflight to see how the human machine reacts. For example, to study the physiological degradation, researchers use long-term bed rest studies. Healthy volunteers are paid to lie in a bed tilted slightly head down, usually at a 6-degree angle, for weeks or months at a time.
A 6-degree angle.
Yeah, this head-down tilt mimics the fluid shifts and the muscular unloading experienced in microgravity.
You see headlines about those studies all the time, framing it as the ultimate lazy dream job. Like, NASA will pay you thousands of dollars to stay in bed for 2 months. It sounds fantastic until you understand the protocols. You literally cannot sit up to eat, to shower, or to use the bathroom. Every bodily function must be performed while tilted backward.
The physical discomfort sets in quickly, but the psychological endurance test is even more brutal. To test equipment mechanics and human reaction times in actual weightlessness, agencies use parabolic flights.
The vomit comet.
That's the one. These aircraft fly in steep, repeating arcs, providing about 20 seconds of free fall at the top of the parabola. And for psychological and operational isolation, they use extreme habitats. Crews spend winters locked inside research stations in Antarctica, or they live in specialized mock spacecraft built in isolated deserts, such as the HIC's habitat in Hawaii.
They also utilize underwater laboratories like the NEMO missions and the Aquarius Reef Base. Saturation diving in an underwater habitat is arguably one of the closest operational analogs to spaceflight.
It really is.
The crew is surrounded by a lethal environment. They are entirely dependent on their life support machinery. They have a strict timeline for tasks, and they cannot simply swim to the surface if there is an emergency without risking fatal decompression sickness. The operational rigor is very real.
It is an excellent test of crew dynamics under pressure. However, careful analysis requires us to recognize the fundamental limitations of these simulations. Ground-based analogs only reproduce selected features of spaceflight. They deliberately leave other features out. No simulation on Earth perfectly reproduces the holistic reality of a Mars mission.
The door problem.
The door problem, exactly. The psychological safety net is always present. You can lock a crew in a habitat in the Utah desert for a year. They will experience the social isolation, the irritating interpersonal dynamics, the limited diet, and the water rationing. But they're still experiencing Earth's gravity.
Right.
Their bodies aren't actively dissolving. They aren't being bombarded by deep space radiation. Most importantly, deep down in their cognitive architecture, they know the simulation is a simulation.
Because they can just walk out.
If a crew member suffers a massive stroke, or if the habitat catches fire, they can open the airlock, break the simulation, and a medical helicopter will be there in an hour.
You cannot simulate the existential weight of being 50 million miles away from the nearest hospital with the absolute certainty that rescue is impossible. The limits of the simulation are just as important as the data the simulation provides.
Absolutely.
So, knowing they can't perfectly simulate the environment, how do they train this carefully selected crew for the inevitable disasters? Because the mission will eventually encounter a failure mode that the engineers on Earth never imagined. The written procedures will not match the reality unfolding in the cabin.
The training methodology shifts from memorization to diagnostic thinking. When you have a spacecraft of that complexity, you have a massive library of procedures. You have nominal checklists for routine operations and contingency checklists for known failure modes. But deep space exploration guarantees the unknown.
The unknown unknowns.
Right. The training instructors, often called SimSup or simulation supervisors, will put the crew in a high-fidelity mock-up and initiate multiple cascading system failures that deliberately contradict the manuals.
So they intentionally break the rules of the simulation to see what the crew does?
Yes. The goal isn't to see if the astronaut can read a checklist faster than anyone else. The goal is to see if the crew can manage their autonomic stress response, communicate clearly without yelling, build a mental model of the malfunctioning system, diagnose the root cause of an impossible situation, and invent a viable survival strategy on the fly, using only the tools they have on board.
They are building mental habits to survive unfamiliar failures.
Exactly.
Synthesizing this, you are not trying to cast an action hero. You're trying to find the ultimate, unflappable, unbothered roommate who also happens to be a rigorous scientist, a brilliant mechanic, and a calm crisis manager who thrives on routine.
That's the perfect resume.
Because once that impeccably trained crew finally ignites the engines and leaves Earth orbit, the very physics of their environment undergoes a radical transformation. This triggers a relentless, sweeping cascade of biological responses.
The human body is suddenly thrust into a mechanical reality it has never encountered in millions of years of evolution. The most profound and immediate change is the cessation of gravity's apparent pull.
Now, we need to correct a massive popular misconception about gravity in space. When the public sees video feeds of astronauts floating effortlessly through the modules of the space station, the overwhelming assumption is that they have traveled far enough away from Earth that gravity simply doesn't reach them anymore.
People think they're in zero gravity because gravity is gone.
Exactly.
But the physics tell a completely different story.
Right.
At the altitude of the International Space Station, again, roughly 250 miles up, the Earth's gravitational pull is still about 90% as strong as it is on the surface.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah. If you built a tower 250 miles high and stood on top of it, you would not float away. You would weigh almost exactly what you weigh right now. The gravity hasn't disappeared. The reason astronauts float is due to the orbital mechanics of continuous freefall.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This concept bends the mind a little bit, but the mechanics of continuous freefall explain everything about how a spacecraft actually moves.
Imagine standing on a very tall mountain and firing a cannonball perfectly horizontally. Gravity immediately begins pulling it downward, and it strikes the ground a few miles away. If you pack more powder and fire it much faster, the cannonball travels much further before the curve of its fall intersects with the ground.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, imagine firing that cannonball so incredibly fast, roughly 17,500 miles per hour, that the downward arc of its fall exactly matches the curvature of the Earth beneath it.
So the spacecraft is constantly falling toward the ground, but because it's moving sideways so fast, the ground is curving away from it at the exact same rate.
The spacecraft is falling. The astronauts inside the spacecraft are falling at the exact same speed. Because they're all falling together, there is zero relative motion between the crew and the walls of the ship. That lack of relative motion creates the physical sensation and the mechanical reality of weightlessness.
The operational consequences of living in continuous freefall are profound. I mean, you are attempting to live and work in an environment without a floor.
It's completely alien.
The entire concept of walking, which we take completely for granted, relies entirely on the friction between the soles of our feet and the ground, a friction generated solely by gravity pulling our mass downward.
In microgravity, traction is a meaningless concept. You cannot walk. To move from one module to another, crews must rely entirely on strategically placed handrails, tethers, foot restraints, and gentle, calculated pushes off solid surfaces. Movement becomes an exercise in managing momentum.
Because Newton's laws are suddenly very apparent. If you push off a bulkhead too hard to cross the cabin, there is no friction from the floor or the air to slow you down. You will simply fly across the module and smash into the opposite wall, potentially injuring yourself or damaging delicate equipment.
Beyond the sheer mechanics of moving your body, this state of freefall completely scrambles the human sensory system. We have to discuss the physiological crisis of losing up and down.
Our brains must hate that.
They really do. On Earth, your brain constructs its spatial awareness by constantly cross-referencing three main sensory inputs. You have your vision, giving you visual cues of the horizon. You have the proprioceptive cues from your body, the physical pressure on the soles of your feet, or the tension in your postural muscles. And, most importantly, you have your vestibular system.
The inner ear apparatus?
Specifically, the otolith organs inside the inner ear. They contain tiny calcium and carbonate crystals resting on a bed of sensory hair cells. Gravity constantly pulls these crystals downward, bending the hairs and sending a continuous signal to your brain telling it exactly which way is down.
But in the continuous free fall of orbit, gravity isn't pulling those crystals against the hair cells anymore. They are just floating inside the inner ear.
The sensory conflict is immediate and severe. An astronaut might be floating upside down relative to a control panel. Their eyes send a signal to the brain saying, "We are inverted." But the vestibular system is screaming, "I have no idea what inverted means. I feel no gravity vector."
That sounds nauseating.
And meanwhile, the proprioceptive system is reporting, "There's no pressure on our feet. We must be falling." This massive neurological mismatch triggers one of the oldest evolutionary defense mechanisms in the human brain.
The brain essentially assumes this level of catastrophic sensory hallucination means the body has ingested a neurotoxin, and the evolutionary response to being poisoned is to immediately purge the stomach.
This results in space motion sickness, also known as space adaptation syndrome. It manifests as severe nausea, profound fatigue, cold sweats, a complete loss of appetite, and sudden vomiting.
That sounds miserable.
The operational impact is significant. For the first few days of a mission, while the nervous system is furiously relying on neuroplasticity to rewire itself, learning to ignore the confused signals from the inner ear and rely almost exclusively on visual cues, the crew can be incapacitated.
And vomiting inside a spacesuit or a crowded cabin without gravity to pull the mess into a bag introduces severe choking hazards and contamination risks. As if the extreme nausea wasn't enough, the body's fluids are also rebelling against the lack of gravity.
It's a full-body revolt.
Without the continuous downward pull keeping fluids pooled in the lower extremities, the crew experiences a massive fluid shift.
In a 1G environment on Earth, your cardiovascular system works incredibly hard, utilizing a complex system of valves and pressure gradients to pump blood up from your legs to your brain against the relentless pull of gravity.
Right.
When you achieve orbit and that gravitational resistance is suddenly removed, the heart continues pumping with the same force. The blood vessels in the legs continue to constrict.
With no gravity fighting back, all that fluid liters of blood and interstitial fluid shifts centrally, flooding into the torso and the head.
This headward fluid shift is responsible for the classic puffy face, bird-leg physical appearance of astronauts in space. Their faces swell, their sinuses become constantly congested, and their legs lose significant girth as the fluid departs.
But the implications are far more serious than cosmetic changes or a stuffy nose, right?
Absolutely. This redistribution alters systemic circulation, changes the pressure dynamics within the skull, and leads to one of the most pressing medical mysteries of long-duration spaceflight: severe vision changes.
We're talking about spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS. How exactly does fluid shifting into the torso affect the structure of the eye?
The underlying mechanics are still being actively researched, but the primary analysis links this prolonged fluid shift to an elevation in intracranial pressure, the pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid inside the skull.
Okay, I follow.
Because the skull is a rigid box, that pressure has to go somewhere. It pushes outward against the weakest point, which happens to be the back of the eye, specifically the optic disc, where the optic nerve attaches.
The pressure is literally pushing the eyeball out of shape.
Over the course of a long-duration flight, this elevated pressure can physically flatten the posterior globe of the eye, swell the optic nerve head, and cause folds in the choroid layer. Astronauts experience hyperopic shifts. They basically become farsighted.
Oh, wow.
Many have reported their vision degrading so much that they require glasses in space when they had perfect 20/20 vision on Earth.
This is a terrifying operational hazard. I mean, a Mars crew needs acute visual acuity to read complex digital displays, perform delicate mechanical maintenance, and pilot the vehicle. If the crew's vision is steadily degrading over a 3-year transit, the mission is in jeopardy.
It's a huge risk.
What is particularly troubling is the individual susceptibility. NASA has found that some astronauts develop severe SANS very quickly, while others fly for months with minimal structural changes to their eyes. We do not yet possess a reliable biometric marker to predict whose eyes will survive a trip to Mars.
And while the fluids are shifting upward and threatening the eyes, the structural foundations of the body, the muscular and skeletal systems, are essentially going into an aggressive early retirement.
Because they simply no longer have a job to do. On Earth, your postural muscles, the calves, the quads, the deep muscles of the back, are constantly firing, making micro-adjustments just to hold your skeleton upright against gravity. In space, that mechanical loading drops to zero.
The human body is a ruthlessly efficient biological machine. It refuses to expend caloric energy maintaining tissues it isn't actively using. Because of this unloading, the muscles begin to atrophy rapidly. Muscle mass and strength plummet.
So they have to fight back.
To combat this, space agencies require rigorous countermeasures. Astronauts do not simply float around enjoying the view. They must engage in intense, deliberate aerobic and resistance exercise for up to 2 hours every single day.
But the machinery required to exercise in space is incredibly complex. You can't just bring a set of dumbbells to Mars. A 50-pound dumbbell in microgravity weighs absolutely nothing. You can lift it with your pinky finger.
Which is why engineers developed devices like the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or ARED, used on the ISS. Instead of relying on the massive iron plates, ARED uses a complex system of vacuum cylinders and flywheel mechanisms to simulate up to 600 pounds of weightlifting resistance.
That's genius.
It allows crews to perform squats, deadlifts, and bench presses by fighting against a vacuum. But even with rigorous exercise, combating the loss of muscle is easier than combating the degradation of the skeleton.
The bone loss is staggering. The skeleton actively begins to dissolve. Let's look at the cellular mechanics of why the body breaks down its own armor.
Bone is not dead calcium. It is dynamic, living tissue that is constantly remodeling itself. This process is driven by two main types of cells: osteoblasts, which build new bone matrix, and osteoclasts, which break down old bone and release the minerals into the bloodstream.
Okay.
On Earth, this remodeling is dictated by mechanotransduction. Every time you walk, run, or jump, the mechanical strain bends the bone microscopically.
That strain forces fluid through tiny canals in the bone, signaling the osteoblasts that the skeleton is under load and needs to be kept dense and strong.
In the weightless environment of space, that mechanical strain vanishes. The signaling stops. The body interprets this lack of load as a clear directive. A heavy, dense skeleton is no longer required for survival in this environment. The delicate balance of remodeling heavily shifts. The osteoclasts begin breaking down bone tissue far faster than the osteoblasts can rebuild it.
The result is rapid onset osteopenia, a severe reduction in bone mineral density, particularly in the weight-bearing bones of the pelvis, spine, and legs. An astronaut can lose bone density at a rate of 1 to 2% per month in space, compared to an elderly person on Earth who might lose 1% per year.
This massive loss of density drastically increases the risk of bone fractures. But the secondary consequence is just as dangerous. All of that calcium being aggressively leached out of the dissolving skeleton dumps directly into the bloodstream. The body has to filter that excess calcium out, and that job falls to the kidneys.
The kidneys become overwhelmed with calcium, creating the perfect chemical environment for the formation of renal stones. I mean, I cannot conceive of a more horrifying medical scenario than an astronaut passing a kidney stone in a cramped module halfway to Mars, with no advanced medical imaging or surgical intervention possible.
It is a major medical contingency that mission planners spend a lot of time preparing for. And alongside the bones and muscles, the cardiovascular system is also quietly remodeling itself.
Because the heart muscle doesn't have to fight gravity to push blood to the brain, its workload decreases significantly.
The left ventricle of the heart, which handles the heavy pumping, can actually lose mass and volume. Furthermore, the baroreceptors, the sensors in the blood vessels that tell the veins in your legs to constrict and push blood upward when you stand, become deconditioned. They essentially forget how to respond to gravity.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is the supreme irony of spaceflight physiology. If you look at the telemetry, the human body isn't actually failing. It is behaving brilliantly. It is adapting perfectly and efficiently to the new environment it finds itself in.
It's surviving.
In continuous freefall, a lighter, less dense skeleton, a smaller heart muscle, and reduced muscle mass are the most optimal biological configurations.
The body is doing exactly what millions of years of evolution trained it to do: adapt to the immediate environment to conserve energy. But the flight surgeons and engineers have to fight this brilliant biological adaptation every single day.
Because the crew is not staying in space forever. They eventually have to re-enter a gravity well. Whether they are landing on the surface of Mars or splashing down back on Earth, the environment will violently shift back to a gravitational state.
Right, they have to come back eventually.
If the medical teams allow the cardiovascular system to fully adapt to microgravity, the results upon landing are catastrophic. When the astronaut tries to stand up in 1G, gravity will instantly pull all of their blood down into their legs. The deconditioned blood vessels won't constrict to push it back up. The brain will be deprived of oxygen, and the astronaut will immediately suffer orthostatic intolerance. They will pass out.
We literally force them to spend 2 hours a day in a torture device to maintain a heavy, energy-expensive, Earth-normal body while living in a space-normal environment. And hovering ominously over all of this internal physiological turmoil is the quiet, invisible hazard of the void: cosmic radiation.
In low Earth orbit, astronauts are still largely shielded by the Earth's magnetosphere. This massive magnetic field acts as a deflector shield, protecting the ISS from the majority of deep space radiation.
But Mars is way past that.
A Mars expedition travels far beyond that protective bubble. Once you leave the Earth-Moon system, You are exposed to the full, unfiltered brunt of the solar system's radiation environment.
The crew is exposed to two distinct types of radiation out there: galactic cosmic rays, or GCRs, and solar particle events, or SPEs.
GCRs are high-energy, heavy ions traveling at nearly the speed of light, blasted out by distant supernovas. They possess immense penetrating power. When a GCR strikes the human body, it can literally tear through the DNA strands within a cell.
That sounds incredibly destructive.
It is. This cumulative damage drastically increases the lifetime risk of developing aggressive cancers and can cause measurable degradation to the central nervous system.
And then you have the acute threat of a solar flare.
A solar particle event is a massive eruption of protons from our own sun. If the spacecraft is caught in the path of a severe SPE without adequate shielding, the crew can absorb a lethal dose of radiation in a matter of hours, leading to acute radiation sickness, cellular death, and potentially fatal consequences before they ever reach Mars.
Protecting against this brings us right back to the brutal engineering economy. You need radiation shielding. The most effective shields are materials rich in hydrogen, like water, or specialized plastics, like polyethylene. But lining the hull of a spacecraft with thick layers of water or plastic adds thousands of kilograms of mass. Mass requires propellant.
The rocket equation strikes again.
So the engineers must calculate a terrifying compromise. How much shielding is just barely enough to keep the crew's cancer risk below a certain statistical threshold without making the spacecraft too heavy to launch?
Every physical adaptation we've discussed, the vestibular confusion, the fluid shifts, the dissolving bones, the cardiovascular deconditioning, the radiation exposure, is occurring simultaneously inside an incredibly confined, heavily utilized volume of space.
Let's shift our focus to the daily, gritty realities of living and staying clean inside that volume. Let's talk about the crowded home. Habitability in deep space is not a matter of luxury or comfort. Habitability directly dictates operational safety.
If the interior cabin is designed poorly, if the lighting is wrong, if the noise levels are too high, if the workspaces are cluttered and illogical, the crew's operational efficiency drops, their cognitive stress spikes, and critical, potentially fatal mistakes get made.
Paint a mental picture of this cabin for us. We are talking about a sealed pressure vessel, roughly the size of a small bus or a large van. This single volume must serve simultaneously as a high-tech orbital laboratory, a bedroom for 4 to 6 people, a kitchen, a bathroom, a medical clinic, a daily gymnasium, an office, a mechanical workshop, and a heavily shielded radiation storm shelter.
It is every single room of a house compressed into a single hallway operating all at once.
And because that hallway is hermetically sealed off from the deadly vacuum outside, the single most critical, actively managed piece of shared infrastructure in that crowded home is the air.
On Earth, we are completely oblivious to the mechanics of air. We take it entirely for granted. The wind blows, thermal currents mix the atmosphere, plants generate oxygen, and the carbon dioxide we exhale simply dissipates into the vastness of the sky.
Inside a spacecraft, atmospheric ventilation is a matter of life and death, measured in minutes. The Environmental Control and Life Support System, or ECLSS, must flawlessly, continuously manufacture oxygen, typically by running an electrical current through water to separate the hydrogen and oxygen atoms.
But creating oxygen is only half the battle. The system must aggressively scrub carbon dioxide out of the air.
Because if CO2 levels rise even slightly, the crew experiences headaches, cognitive impairment, and eventually suffocation. The scrubbing relies on passing the cabin air through chemical beds like zeolites or liquidamines that trap the CO2 molecules, but the system also has to manage water vapor. Human breath and daily sweat release an astonishing amount of moisture into the air.
A huge amount.
If not removed, the humidity would quickly reach 100%. Water would condense on every surface, and the electronics behind the panels would short out.
The ventilation system must also manage the massive thermal loads generated by the avionics, the science payloads, and the body heat of the crew themselves, rejecting that heat out into space via ammonia radiators. It must filter out volatile organic compounds, trace contaminants off-gassing from plastics, and the inevitable odors of several adults exercising heavily in a confined space.
And the physical airflow itself has to be constant and meticulously engineered. This goes back to the physics of microgravity. Because there is no gravity, there is no natural convection.
Convection is the engine of air mixing on Earth. Hot air is less dense than cold air, so gravity pulls the cold air down, forcing the hot air to rise. This creates natural circulation. In microgravity, that process completely stops. Air does not mix on its own.
This is where that horrific scenario from the introduction comes into play.
If a crew member is sleeping in a poorly ventilated corner of the crew quarters, Or if a ventilation fan fails, the carbon dioxide they exhale will not dissipate. It will simply form a stagnant, expanding, invisible bubble around their head. They can literally asphyxiate in their own breath while they sleep,
So forced air ventilation fans must run continuously, pulling air through every corner of the ship.
which introduces a massive habitability problem. The unrelenting, inescapable noise of the fans. It is a constant industrial roar. And just as the air is a carefully managed, closed loop, the water system must be a tightly closed loop.
Water is not a disposable supply on a Mars mission. It is a carefully monitored, infinitely precious inventory. Water is heavy. A single liter weighs a kilogram. You physically cannot launch with enough freshwater tanks to sustain a crew for 3 years. The mass penalty would break the rocket equation immediately.
So the spacecraft machinery must recover, process, and reuse every single drop of moisture available.
Which means treating and recycling wastewater. The crew must drink their own recycled fluids.
The life support system features complex recovery machinery that captures the ambient humidity from the air, all that sweat and exhalation we just discussed. But it also processes the crew's urine. The urine is collected, mixed with stabilizing chemicals to prevent microbial growth, and pumped into a rotary distiller.
Because liquids don't settle in a tank in zero gravity, right? They have to use a centrifuge drum to spin the liquid to the edges, boil it in a vacuum at low temperatures, and collect the pure water vapor.
Exactly. That vapor is condensed, mixed with the captured humidity, and run through a series of multi-filtration beds and a high-temperature catalytic oxidation reactor that destroys any remaining volatile organics or bacteria. It is then dosed with iodine or silver to keep it sterile.
And the resulting fluid is chemically purer than almost any municipal tap water on Earth.
The engineering reality is that yesterday's coffee becomes tomorrow's coffee. The psychological hurdle is significant, but the physical reality is that the water loop must be closed. And because water is so strictly rationed and difficult to process, it radically alters how the crew manages personal hygiene.
We have to completely abandon the concept of a shower. Early space stations, like Skylab in the 1970s, experimented with a collapsible shower enclosure. It was an operational nightmare.
Oh, I've heard about this.
Without gravity to pull the water down the drain, the water clung to the astronaut's skin in thick, suffocating blobs. They had to use a specialized vacuum hose to suck the water off their bodies and the walls of the enclosure. It wasted immense amounts of time and strained the water recovery system.
Today, abundant running water for hygiene is simply not an option. Showers are entirely replaced by sponge baths. The crew uses damp towels, prepackaged hygienic wipes, and specialized rinseless shampoos and body washes formulated for hospitals that do not require rinsing off.
You are relying on a damp cloth, a few squirts of liquid soap, and the continuous airflow of the cabin fans to evaporate the moisture off your skin to stay clean for 3 continuous years.
This intimate proximity and lack of rigorous bathing brings us to the unseen, rapidly mutating inhabitants of the spacecraft, the microbiome. Humans are not sterile machines. We are walking, breathing ecosystems. We carry incredibly complex communities of bacteria, fungi, and viruses with us into this sealed environment.
And a warm, perfectly sealed, humid, continuously circulated environment is a utopia for microbial growth. The air filters, the recycled water lines, the food preparation surfaces, and the waste management hardware all create vectors for microbial transfer. In the absence of competition from a broader terrestrial ecosystem, certain aggressive strains of bacteria and fungi can dominate.
The source material highlights that this isn't just a threat to the crew's health, though respiratory infections are a major concern. It is a direct threat to the machinery.
Biofilms are a massive engineering hazard. Fungal mats and bacterial colonies will grow behind panels, feeding on the trace organics and condensation. They can produce acids that actively degrade rubber seals, eat through wire insulation, and foul the sensitive membranes in the water recovery system.
Managing the microbiology of the spacecraft, constantly swabbing surfaces and analyzing the fungal loads, is just as critical as managing the electrical telemetry.
Which logically and inevitably brings us to the most delicate, highly engineered, and absolutely vital piece of hardware on the entire ship: the space toilet.
It is a marvel of fluid dynamics and mechanical engineering. It often gets treated as a punchline in popular media, but waste containment in a closed-loop pressure vessel is a Tier 1 health and safety requirement.
We have to examine this respectfully, but it is impossible not to appreciate the stark contrast. You have these brilliant astronauts, the absolute peak of human achievement, operating million-dollar robotic arms and conducting heroic scientific exploration, and yet a significant portion of their training involves figuring out how to successfully go to the bathroom when gravity refuses to help things fall.
The engineering challenge is immense. On Earth, gravity does all the work of separation and containment. Without gravity, you have to replace that downward pull with aggressive, targeted airflow. Space toilets rely on pneumatic suction.
And the positioning has to be exact, right?
The positioning of the astronaut on the commode must be incredibly precise, often requiring the use of thigh restraints and footholds to maintain a seal.
Because any failure of that seal, any loose biological material escaping in a weightless environment will immediately float into the cabin and contaminate the breathable air. It is a truly unacceptable, potentially mission-ending hazard.
The machinery inside the toilet is complex. When collecting liquid waste, the airflow entrains the fluid, pulling it into a rotary separator. A rapidly spinning fan acts as a centrifuge, separating the heavier liquid from the air. The liquid is pumped to the urine processor, and the air is passed through deep odor control filters before being returned to the cabin.
And the solid waste.
Solid waste is pulled into a separate receptacle, compacted and sealed in breathable bags that allow moisture to evaporate into the cabin air, where it is captured by the ECLSS, while trapping the solid material in the odor.
The engineers have to solve for intense odor mitigation, for the inevitable mechanical breakdown of these complex separator fans, for acoustic dampening so the entire crew doesn't hear the machinery operating, for privacy in a space the size of a van, and they must design interfaces that accommodate the highly varied body sizes and anatomical needs of a diverse crew. If the toilet's primary fan motor burns out on a Mars transit, it is an immediate catastrophic crisis.
And the challenge of containment extends beyond biological waste. The source material heavily emphasizes that trash does not magically vanish.
Everything you bring with you creates a byproduct. Food packaging, used hygiene wipes, worn-out clothing, broken circuit boards, expended experiment materials. On Earth, we have the luxury of throwing things away. In a spacecraft on a multi-year trajectory, there is no way.
It just sits there, traveling with you. You cannot simply open a window and jettison garbage into the void. Therefore, the architectural design of the ship must account for the strict restraint and management of trash. Crews must meticulously label, compact, and securely stow every piece of refuse in designated, odor-proof containment areas, managing a slowly expanding volume of dead weight that constantly consumes their precious living space.
We've extensively managed the biological and mechanical waste coming out of the human body. The other side of that survival equation is what must go into the body. Let's look at fueling the biological machine. Because food in deep space bridges a fascinating critical gap between strict nutritional necessity and absolute psychological survival.
The primary foundational function of space food is as a life support system. It must supply the exact caloric energy and precise micronutrients the crew requires to maintain their physical performance, particularly when they're burning immense amounts of calories exercising 2 hours a day to fight bone loss.
But the physical constraints placed on that food by the engineering economy are immense.
First and foremost, the food must be perfectly safe. A widespread case of bacterial food poisoning like salmonella inside a spacecraft with one toilet and limited medical supplies would be a mission-ending disaster. The food must be highly stable, meaning it requires no refrigeration, which consumes too much power and mass. It must be densely compacted and lightweight, returning us to the constraints of the rocket equation.
And it has to actually taste good.
Crucially, yes, it must be palatable enough that the crew will actually consume enough calories.
Which introduces the ultimate test of food science, the Mars shelf life.
A multi-year expedition radically tests every known parameter of food preservation. Consider the timeline. The meal an astronaut consumes on day 800 of a Mars surface mission was likely prepared, thermally stabilized, and sealed in a pouch years before the mission ever launched from Earth.
The biochemistry of the food changes over that time. Retaining the nutritional value is incredibly difficult. Vitamins, particularly vitamin C and the B vitamins, naturally degrade over time, especially when exposed to ambient radiation. A crew eating 3-year-old food might be consuming sufficient calories but slowly starving of vital micronutrients, leading to scurvy or neurological issues.
Preserving the reality, the texture, and the flavor profile over years so the crew won't suffer from menu fatigue is a massive hurdle. Lipid oxidation makes fats taste rancid. If the food becomes unpalatable, astronauts simply stop eating, their performance plummets, and they lose critical mass.
And the physical act of eating presents its own unique dangers to the machinery of the ship. We have to talk about the crumb hazard. You cannot just open a bag of potato chips or bite into a flaky, crusty croissant in microgravity.
Liquids, crumbs, dry powders, and loose sauces must be strictly engineered and controlled. On Earth, if you drop a crumb or spill a drop of water, gravity pulls it harmlessly to the floor where you sweep it up later. In continuous freefall, a crumb is not debris, it is a floating projectile.
It becomes a hazard to both the biology and the hardware. A floating salt crystal can be inhaled, causing a coughing fit or aspiration pneumonia. A crumb can drift into an astronaut's eye, causing a painful corneal abrasion that is incredibly difficult to treat in space.
Hardware is equally vulnerable. A floating droplet of hot sauce or a crumb of bread can get sucked into the main ventilation returns, clogging the life support filters. Worse, it can drift behind an instrument panel, float into a sensitive electronics bay, and bridge a connection on a circuit board, causing a catastrophic short circuit or a fire.
This is why space food relies heavily on surface tension. Tortillas completely replace bread because they crumble significantly less. Sauces and gravies are formulated to be thick enough that their surface tension keeps them adhered to the spoon and the food pouch. The physical mechanics of eating are entirely re-engineered. But despite all these clinical, physical constraints, the meals themselves serve a massive, irreplaceable psychological purpose.
Meals create an anchor. In an environment where every minute of the day is rigidly scheduled by mission control, where the physical scenery outside the tiny windows is an endless, unchanging black void, shared food helps mark the passage of time.
It provides the only real sensory variety in their day.
Exactly. It preserves a vital sense of Earth culture and humanity. Mandating that the crew assemble to share a meal forces them to stop working, to communicate, to decompress, and to monitor each other's mental state. The menu variety, the ability to select their own meals, and the simple act of sharing food are as psychologically important as the raw caloric content.
And if they stop enjoying the food?
If the food quality degrades, morale immediately plummets, and a demoralized, depressed crew is prone to making fatal operational errors.
Which perfectly transitions our deep dive to the final and undoubtedly the most complex, unpredictable system on the entire spacecraft. We have extensively covered the mechanical engineering, the fluid shifts, the dissolving bones, the crowded habitat, the toilet, and the food. Now we must face the true wild card, the mind inside the machine. Let's examine the psychology and society of a tiny, isolated crew in deep space.
The foundational pillar of all psychological health and cognitive performance is sleep. In the high-stakes environment of spaceflight, sleep is not treated as rest or leisure. It is a critical, mandated performance requirement.
But achieving deep, restorative sleep in that van is incredibly difficult. You previously mentioned the continuous industrial roar of the ventilation fans. You have the persistent hum of the fluid pumps. You have incredibly high cognitive workload and operational stress, and you have severe circadian disruption. In low Earth orbit, a spacecraft traveling at 17,500 miles per hour circles the globe every 90 minutes. That means the crew experiences a blazing orbital sunrise blazing through the windows every hour and a half, completely scrambling their biological clocks.
On a Mars transit, the situation is reversed, but equally disruptive. There are no external day-night cues at all, just endless blackness. All of these factors, the noise, the artificial lighting, the stress-shattered normal sleep architecture, the astronauts experience fragmented sleep, failing to reach the deep REM cycles necessary for neurological repair.
And the consequence of chronic sleep disruption is devastating to a mission. It heavily degrades sustained attention, impairs working memory, and most critically, it destroys complex executive decision-making. If you were sleep-deprived on Earth, you might accidentally leave your keys on the counter. If you are sleep-deprived while navigating a complex orbital insertion maneuver around Mars, you might input the wrong burn duration, and the mistake is fatal.
Sleep must be aggressively protected, often requiring specialized light therapy and strict scheduling.
But even when the crew is wide awake and well-rested, they are trapped in a profound psychological paradox. An expeditionary crew is simultaneously experiencing extreme social crowding and extreme geographical isolation.
It is an entirely unnatural state for the human animal. Inside the cabin, you have absolutely zero privacy. You are constantly in the physical presence, or at least the auditory earshot, of the exact same 3 or 4 people for years. You hear them chew their food, you hear them breathe, you hear every time they use the toilet, you know every single story they have to tell. You are socially suffocated by proximity.
But at that exact same moment, you are geographically more isolated than any human beings in the history of the species. You are millions of miles away from your family, your support network, and the entire terrestrial biosphere. You have zero ability to physically escape. You cannot leave your colleagues. You cannot leave your workspace because your laboratory is your bedroom. You cannot step outside and take a walk around the block to cool off after a heated argument.
Which means interpersonal conflict has absolutely nowhere to go. It cannot dissipate.
Wow.
Yet, in a normal terrestrial environment, small professional disagreements eventually fade. You leave the office, you commute home, you vent your frustrations to your spouse, you sleep in your own bed, and the tension resets. Inside a spacecraft, the tension has no outlet. Small, seemingly trivial disagreements, friction about how someone organizes their tools, frustration over someone's hygiene standards, irritation at the loud noises a crewmate makes while using the aerated exercise machine, or debates about leadership styles and risk assessments. These micro-frictions do not fade. They accumulate dangerously.
They become magnified in the echo chamber of the cabin.
They fester. If they are not actively managed, these micro-frictions can completely fracture the crew's social cohesion. They divide into factions, they stop communicating critical operational data to one another. Therefore, interpersonal communication, conflict resolution, and the active deliberate repair of working relationships are not soft, human resources buzzwords for a Mars crew. They are literal, hard mission survival skills. The crew must be intensely trained in psychological de-escalation.
Because, bringing us back to the ultimate stakes of the Mars mission, they are entirely on their own. The sheer physical distance creates complete, undeniable autonomy.
The communication delay fundamentally changes the command structure. Because of the 40-minute round trip for a simple radio transmission we discussed earlier, Earth can no longer provide real-time direction during a crisis. If a fire breaks out in an electronics bay, if a toxic coolant leak triggers an alarm, or if a crew member suffers a severe laceration, the crew cannot wait for the flight directors in Houston to convene a panel and tell them what to do.
If they wait 40 minutes for instructions, the ship burns up or the crew member bleeds out. The solution and the authority to execute that solution has to reside entirely on board.
The crew requires an unprecedented level of onboard expertise. They must transition from being operators who execute daily schedules written by Earth to being autonomous commanders of their own mission. They need the authority to make critical, life-altering decisions without asking for permission. They need sophisticated software that gives them access to all diagnostic data, flexible planning tools to rewrite their own schedules, and complete independent medical capability, including the ability to perform minor surgery or administer advanced pharmacology without a doctor looking over their shoulder.
I want to ask the listener one final time, drawing on that van analogy from the very beginning. Imagine being locked in a heavy metal vault for 3 years with 3 of your coworkers. You cannot call a repairman if the life support machinery stalls. You cannot order a pizza if you hate the stabilized food pouches. You cannot take a walk to cool off after a massive screaming argument with your mission commander. You are completely, utterly, and terrifyingly reliant on each other and the humming machinery embedded in the walls around you. So, after exploring the engineering trades, the dissolving bones, the closed water loops, and the psychological paradoxes, what does this all mean for the future of deep space travel?
If we synthesize this entire deep dive and connect it to the broader picture of human exploration, it means we have to radically shift how we view these missions. The general public often views the life support systems, the zero-gravity toilets, the vacuum-sealed food packages, the massive exercise resistance machines, the rigid sleep schedules, the microbial swabbing, the tedious maintenance routines, and the psychological relationship counseling as trivial distractions from the grand romantic endeavor of space exploration.
People think of those biological necessities as the boring, gross stuff you just have to ignore so you can get back to the cool rocket science and the planetary geology.
But the reality is that the biology is the science. These practical, gritty, biological details are exactly what make the exploration possible in the first place. The engineering of the everyday human experience is the true triumph of spaceflight. Without mastering the human element, without perfectly closing the water loop and managing the micro-frictions of the mind, the greatest, most powerful rocket ever built by humanity is nothing more than a very fast, very expensive tomb.
That is incredibly well said. The human body is the ultimate payload and it demands the ultimate engineering. We want to respectfully acknowledge that the technical insights, the historical context, and the fascinating framework we've explored today are drawn from the Cosmora HQ Companion Overview of Packing for Mars, The Curious Science of Life in the Void by Mary Roach.
Is a truly remarkable investigation into the granular, often messy details that are routinely excluded from the heroic, sterilized mission narratives we usually see.
We highly encourage you to obtain the legally available original book to experience the author's complete, in-depth reporting, her vivid examples, her real-world encounters with astronaut training, and her highly distinctive perspective on everything we've talked about today.
As we wrap up, this entire discussion raises an important final question. A thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We have spent this time discussing how brilliant engineers and scientists must painstakingly design, measure, calculate, and fight for every single microscopic aspect of human survival and happiness for a trip to Mars. They have to literally invent breathable air, synthesize pure water from waste, simulate the pull of gravity with vacuum tubes, engineer the crumb-free physics of food, and meticulously curate the psychology of the crew. So what does that agonizing multi-billion-dollar effort teach us about how perfectly and how completely invisibly the Earth provides all these miraculous things for you, entirely for free, every single day?
It really reframes everything you see when you walk outside, doesn't it? Before we look out into the terrifying void of deep space and dream of Mars, we should probably take a moment to appreciate the absolute miracle that we don't have to live in a sealed van. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a deep breath of that massive, unengineered, unfiltered, gravity-bound Earth air, and we will catch you next time.